What if everything you thought was unshakable was already beginning to fall apart? What if behind the headlines, beneath the politics, and beyond the silence, there was a truth too powerful to ignore? But this isn't just another speech. This is a journey through the unfolding collapse of a nation that once stood as a symbol of power and permanence. It's not driven by hate or anger, but by courage, facts, and the voices that the world can no longer silence. Stay with us, not just to hear what's happening, but to feel why it matters. Because by the end of this video, you won't just see the collapse, you'll understand the proof, the purpose, and the power of truth in a world waking up. Watch closely, listen deeply, and allow your heart to decide what justice really looks like. The internal divisions within Israel are more than just political disagreements. They are existential fractures that threaten the very foundation of the state. Over the past few years, the rift between secular and religious communities has widened dramatically. The secular population, often concentrated in urban centers like Tel Aviv, advocates for liberal values, minority rights, and judicial independence. In contrast, the ultra-Orthodox and religious nationalist groups, growing in both numbers and political influence, seek a state rooted in religious law, often at odds with democratic principles. These opposing visions are not coexisting peacefully. They are colliding with increasing force, visible in the waves of mass protests, strikes, and legal confrontations that have gripped the country. Adding to this is the polarizing leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, whose multiple corruption indictments and controversial judicial overhaul plans have sparked some of the largest protests in Israeli history. His administration's attempts to weaken the Supreme Court and consolidate executive power have led to deep distrust among segments of the population, including former military leaders, tech entrepreneurs, and even members of the Mossad. For many Israelis, this feels less like political reform and more like the dismantling of democracy. These developments have led to a breakdown of the social contract that once held Israeli society together, exposing fault lines that were long ignored or denied. The Israeli Defense Forces, long seen as a unifying institution, are also facing internal dissent. Dozens of reservists and former generals have spoken out against the government's direction, with some even refusing to serve. When the military, a pillar of national identity and security, starts to fragment along ideological lines, it signals a severe crisis. Trust in national institutions is eroding, and the sense of shared purpose that once defined the Israeli population is fading fast. Ethnic and socioeconomic divides further compound the instability. Tensions between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, between Jewish citizens and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and between the wealthy elite and the struggling working class are intensifying. The myth of a cohesive Israeli identity is unraveling under the weight of these divisions. As the internal conflicts deepen, the country becomes more vulnerable, strategically, economically, and socially. A nation divided from within cannot effectively respond to external threats or maintain long-term stability. Israel's global standing is undergoing a significant shift marked by the erosion of long-standing diplomatic and political support from the international community, once considered an untouchable ally of the West, particularly of the United States and several European powers. Israel now finds itself increasingly isolated in global forums and subject to growing scrutiny. A major driver of this shift is the visibility of its actions in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially the frequent military operations in Gaza, the expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank, and the blockade that has resulted in humanitarian crises. These policies, once explained away under the guise of security, are now being challenged openly by human rights organizations, world leaders, and civil society. The United Nations has seen a rise in resolutions condemning Israeli actions, many of which receive overwhelming support from member nations. While the U.S. still frequently vetoes such resolutions in the Security Council, growing pressure from its own citizens and political representatives is making such support more politically costly. In recent years, several American politicians, particularly from the younger progressive wing, have openly criticized Israeli policies, calling them violations of international law and even describing them as apartheid. This rhetoric would have been unimaginable just a decade ago. but now reflects a broader transformation in global consciousness. European nations, too, have started reevaluating their unconditional support. Some have moved toward recognizing the Palestinian statehood, while others have imposed restrictions on arms sales and economic cooperation due to human rights concerns. This shift is not just occurring at the governmental level. It is deeply reflected in public opinion. Global protests in cities like London, Paris, New York, and Berlin have become common whenever there is a flare-up in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These protests are no longer fringe or one-sided. They represent a mainstream moral outcry that challenges the legitimacy of continued occupation and aggression. International non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have released scathing reports describing Israeli actions as apartheid, bringing further legitimacy to the global criticism. Even in regions once politically neutral or silent on the issue, like South America, Africa, and parts of Asia, there is an increasing chorus of voices calling for justice and accountability. Israel's global image as a resilient democracy is giving way to a reputation marred by militarism and oppression, weakening its diplomatic leverage and international alliances. The rise of organized and determined resistance against Israel marks one of the most pivotal shifts in the region's balance of power in recent decades. What once were fragmented and localized struggles have now evolved into a unified, strategic, and ideologically driven front stretching from Gaza to southern Lebanon, from Syria to Yemen. This coalition of resistance, often referred to as the Axis of Resistance, includes not only Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, but also Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iranian-backed militias across Iraq and Syria. These groups, though diverse in origin and ideology, now operate with increasing coordination, intelligence sharing, and technological sophistication. Their actions are no longer reactive. They are calculated, symbolic, and designed to strike at both Israel's military infrastructure and psychological resilience. In Gaza, the capabilities of resistance groups have evolved significantly. The homemade rockets have been replaced with longer-range, more accurate missiles capable of reaching Tel Aviv and beyond. These weapons now come with precision guidance, coordinated timing, and tactical sophistication. Hezbollah in Lebanon remains one of the most heavily armed non-state actors in the world, with tens of thousands of advanced rockets and drones and a combat-hardened network that is deeply entrenched across southern Lebanon. Any confrontation with Hezbollah is no longer a border skirmish. It is a full-scale threat that could paralyze Israeli cities and overwhelm the Iron Dome defense system. Iran's strategic backing has elevated this resistance to a regional force multiplier. With drone technology, advanced missile systems, and cyber capabilities, these groups can launch multi-pronged attacks that strain Israel's resources and expose vulnerabilities. The recent conflicts have demonstrated a new reality. Israel is no longer facing uncoordinated uprisings, but a regional alliance with shared objectives and tactical integration. This resistance is fueled not just by politics, but by a deep, long-standing sense of injustice, occupation, and humiliation. It is this moral drive that makes it resilient in the face of overwhelming military odds. Moreover, this resistance is not just military, it is ideological and psychological. Each successful strike, each defiance under blockade, each show of solidarity across fronts chips away at Israel's image of invincibility. The psychological warfare has shifted. Fear is no longer one-sided. The Israeli public is increasingly experiencing what it once believed was only reserved for its enemies: uncertainty, vulnerability, and trauma. The balance of fear is changing, and with it, the long-standing narrative of regional dominance. Israel's economy, once hailed as the startup nation and a beacon of innovation in the Middle East, is now showing signs of deepening vulnerability. Years of military expenditure, political instability, and growing global criticism have started to take a toll on both investor confidence and economic performance. At the heart of this strain is the enormous cost of maintaining a high-level security posture across multiple fronts. With ongoing operations in Gaza, threats from Hezbollah in the north, and increased defense spending to counter Iran and regional resistance, Israel is diverting billions into its military budget, resources that could have been used to support education, healthcare, infrastructure, and civil society. This imbalance is not sustainable and is beginning to reflect in economic indicators. The Israeli tech sector, long the pride of the nation, has started showing cracks. Following controversial judicial reforms and widespread protests, many international investors and venture capitalists have pulled back, with some major companies announcing relocation plans or freezing their investments. The political uncertainty and fear of authoritarian drift have made Israel less attractive to global markets. Furthermore, domestic entrepreneurs and scientists have expressed disillusionment, and a growing number are seeking opportunities abroad, leading to a gradual brain drain that threatens long-term innovation and competitiveness. Adding to the economic burden are international boycotts and sanctions. The global boycott, divestment, and sanctions (BDS) movement, although controversial, has gained momentum, especially among academic institutions, artists, and major European businesses. These economic measures, coupled with trade hesitations and diplomatic tensions, have begun to impact sectors like agriculture, tourism, and exports. Israel's dependency on strong Western economic alliances makes this backlash particularly damaging, especially when major allies start reassessing trade deals or arms contracts in light of human rights concerns. Demographically, the nation is undergoing a complex shift. The Arab population within Israel and the occupied territories is growing at a faster rate than the Jewish population, leading to anxieties among policymakers about the future ethnic and political makeup of the state. At the same time, the ultra-Orthodox community, many of whom did not serve in the military and often live below the poverty line, is expanding rapidly. These demographic realities place increasing pressure on the welfare system and further polarize the political landscape as different groups demand radically different visions for the country's future. Combined, these economic and demographic stressors are accelerating the internal erosion of stability and coherence, creating fractures that can no longer be ignored or concealed behind military power or international alliances. Israel's moral and spiritual crisis lies at the heart of its growing collapse, a crisis that is not immediately visible in military reports or economic charts, but profoundly evident in its societal conscience and global image. A nation's identity is shaped not just by its borders or institutions, but by the ethical choices it makes, especially when holding power. For decades, Israel has positioned itself as a democratic haven in a hostile region, a nation born out of the horrors of persecution, promising never to repeat the injustices it once endured. Yet, the treatment of Palestinians under occupation tells a story that starkly contradicts that narrative. With each demolished home, each restriction of movement, each life lost in Gaza, a part of Israel's moral claim weakens, eroding the spiritual foundation upon which it was built. The world has begun to notice the widening gap between Israel's self-image and its actions. Accusations of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and systemic discrimination are no longer fringe claims. They are the conclusions of respected international organizations and observers. These are not just legal indictments, they are moral indictments, challenging the very soul of the state. For a nation that insists on its moral exceptionalism, such global scrutiny cuts deep, and within Israel itself, a growing number of voices, journalists, academics, former soldiers, are raising alarms, questioning what kind of society is being created behind walls and checkpoints. Even among Jewish communities around the world, particularly younger generations, the bond with Israel is becoming strained. They are increasingly unwilling to support a state that invokes Jewish identity while enacting policies that contradict their values of justice, compassion, and equality. This spiritual rupture is not only external, but internal, an identity crisis that strikes at the heart of Israeli society. The myth of a righteous nation is faltering under the weight of reality. Soldiers who once believed they were defending their homeland now wrestle with orders that target civilians. Citizens who once felt pride in their nation now feel shame or detachment. Religious teachings that emphasize human dignity and peace are being drowned out by nationalist rhetoric and calls for domination. As these moral contradictions deepen, they affect every level of society, from politics and education to culture and faith. A state that loses its moral compass cannot lead its people toward peace, nor can it expect the world to follow its claims without question. Spiritual decline is often the silent beginning of a nation's downfall. weakening its unity, its purpose, and ultimately its right to stand as a moral authority among nations. The rise of a new global consciousness has significantly altered the way the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is perceived, understood, and responded to by the international community. For decades, narratives surrounding the conflict were tightly controlled by powerful media outlets and political alliances, particularly in the West, shaping public opinion in favor of Israel while minimizing or misrepresenting the suffering of Palestine. However, the emergence of social media, independent journalism, and digital activism has disrupted this control, allowing uncensored images, first-hand accounts, and real-time updates to reach millions of people across the globe. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube have become battlegrounds of information, where voices once silenced now speak with clarity and reach. Young people in particular are leading this awakening. Unburdened by the Cold War-era loyalties and unfiltered by establishment media, they are demanding justice, accountability, and truth. Hashtags like Free Palestine and viral videos showing the destruction of homes, hospitals, and schools have shifted the moral calculus for many who once remained indifferent. This global youth movement does not rely on political ideologies or national affiliations, but is rooted in a universal sense of human dignity and solidarity with the oppressed. They are questioning long-held assumptions and challenging politicians, institutions, and even their own communities to take a stand. This consciousness is also spreading among intellectuals, artists, athletes, and public figures who are now more willing to speak out despite the risks of backlash or censorship. University campuses, cultural festivals, and even corporate spaces have become arenas for protest and discourse, reflecting the demand for a more honest and just global order. The call for human rights and equality is no longer limited to humanitarian circles. It is becoming mainstream and unavoidable. Furthermore, international legal bodies and human rights organizations are finding renewed support and legitimacy as their findings and reports resonate with the broader public. The new generation sees these institutions not as distant bureaucracies, but as tools for justice and change. As truth becomes more visible and accessible, it becomes harder for any government, including Israel, to hide behind old narratives or manipulate public perception. The monopoly on storytelling has been broken, and with it, the foundation of moral impunity. This shift in consciousness represents a fundamental threat to the status quo. It is not just about changing opinions. It is about empowering people to act, organize, boycott, speak out, and demand policy change. The world is watching, questioning, and most importantly, waking up. We have walked through the cracks forming beneath the surface of a nation once seen as unshakable. A collapse does not always begin with explosions or announcements. It begins with silence, with fracture, with denial. Israel's unraveling is not fiction. It is written in its own streets, in the defiance of the oppressed, in the shifting alliances of a world that is no longer blind. From internal divisions to moral decay, from economic strain to rising resistance, and most of all, from the unstoppable rise of global truth-telling, this collapse is not coming. It has already begun. The story is changing. The world is changing. And history is being rewritten by the courage of those who speak truth, even when it's dangerous. Whether you stand in protest, speak through your art, post on your timeline, or pray in silence, know this: your voice matters. Justice does not sleep forever. And when the powerful fall, it is the truth that stands tall. Thank you for watching with an open heart and a thoughtful mind. May you always have the strength to stand for what's right, even when it's unpopular, and the wisdom to see beyond the headlines. Stay awake, stay aware, and never underestimate the power of your voice. Good luck on your journey of truth, and may justice, wherever it lives, always guide your path.